The warning at Vega Prime. The Galactic Council had not convened an emergency session in over 400 years. The last time all 12 species had gathered under one roof, it was to sign the Accord of Elysium, a peace treaty that ended the Kraven Purge and saved 11 billion lives. Now, the vast crystalline dome of Vega Prime Station glowed beneath a bruised nebula, and every ambassador who entered its halls wore fear on their face like a second skin. Ambassador Sela of the Aerith, tall, blue-skinned, her bioluminescent markings flickering with anxiety, was the first to speak. She stood at the center of the circular chamber where holographic stars drifted overhead, casting pale light on the gathered delegates. "The Vorith fleet has crossed the Helion border," she said. Her voice was calm, but the lights beneath her skin pulsed rapid orange. 17 systems have gone dark in the past 6 rotations. Kelmara 4 is burning. We have confirmation that 3 billion citizens of the Confederation are dead. Silence. Then a low, continuous hum from the Garathi. Their species expressed grief through vibration. The sound filled the chamber like a lament for the stars themselves. High Consul Dravan of the Meridian Compact leaned forward in his chair. His 4 eyes swept the room. We all knew this day would come. The Vorith have been massing on the border for 20 cycles. We did nothing. We hoped they would stop. His mandibles clicked. They did not stop. "Then we go to war," said Commander Yoth of the Krell Alliance. His armored fist struck the table. "We mobilize the combined fleet. All 12 species contribute. We stop them at the Centaurus line before they reach the core worlds." Ambassador Sela shook her head slowly. "The combined fleet cannot stand against the Vorith. Not as we are. Their bioships regenerate faster than we can destroy them. Their commanders operate on a distributed consciousness. You kill one, the others adapt instantly. We have run the simulations, Commander. Every one of them ends the same way." "And how do they end?" Dravan asked, though something in his posture suggested he already knew. "With our extinction." The word fell into the chamber like a stone into still water. Ripples of distress moved through every delegate. The Garathi's hum deepened. It was then that the youngest member of the council spoke. Ambassador Tessali of the Renari, a species who had only recently earned a seat at the table, raised her small, iridescent hand. "There is one option we have not discussed," she said carefully. Sela's bioluminescent markings went dark for a moment. She knew what was coming. "You cannot be suggesting," Dravan began. "The humans," Tessali said. Every delegate in the room stiffened. The Garathi stopped humming. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was the silence of a species collective holding its breath. The humans, the youngest spacefaring civilization in the Council's history. Only 2 centuries since their first warp jump. Only 80 years since their formal admission to the galactic community. They were considered a curiosity, emotional, irrational, dangerously creative, and utterly baffling to every species that encountered them. The Council had given them observer status, a minor trade agreement, and largely expected them to stay quiet and learn. They had not stayed quiet. In the 80 years since their admission, human explorers had charted 17 previously unknown star systems. Human engineers had solved the Gordian problem of gravitational folding, a mathematical puzzle that had stumped 3 elder civilizations for centuries. Human diplomats had brokered 4 separate ceasefires between species who had been at war for generations. And human soldiers, the few who had served in joint peacekeeping operations, had demonstrated a capacity for violence and sacrifice that left their alien partners simultaneously grateful and disturbed. "We cannot ask the humans," Sela said firmly. "The Council resolution is clear. Species under observer status are not eligible for combat deployment. They are here to learn, not to fight our wars." "That resolution was written when we believed we would always have the strength to fight our own wars," Tessali replied. "The Vorith have changed that calculation. The humans are unpredictable," said Ambassador Vox of the ancient Selendi, speaking for the first time. Vox was 700 years old and had witnessed the fall of 3 civilizations. When Vox spoke, people listened. "I have studied them extensively. They do not follow logical threat assessment. They act on emotion, on something they call principle. They fight for reasons that have no strategic value. They will throw their lives away for a stranger's child. They will negotiate for hours and then abandon the negotiation to rescue a single wounded soldier. They are chaos given form." "With respect, Elder Vox," Tessali said, "chaos may be exactly what we need against an enemy that has already solved every conventional strategy we possess." The debate raged for hours. Outside the crystalline dome, the bruised nebula churned, and somewhere in the direction of the Helion border, a dozen more worlds were learning what it meant to meet the Vorith. In the end, the vote was 7-5. The Council would send a delegation to Earth. They would ask the humans for help. Ambassador Sela abstained. She stared at the stars overhead as the other delegates filed out, her markings cycling through colors that had no name in any language but her own. She was afraid, not of the Vorith, but of what she was about to unleash, because she had read the human history files. All of them. Every war, every atrocity, every impossible comeback, every moment where humanity had been cornered, outnumbered, and outmatched, and had found a way to win anyway. She was afraid because she believed the humans would say yes. And she was more afraid of what would happen after. The humans say yes. Secretary General Amara Diallo had been in office for 3 years when the alien delegation arrived on Earth without warning. 3 diplomatic shuttles descended through the clouds over Geneva on a Tuesday morning, landing in the courtyard of the United Nations complex while schoolchildren on a field trip pressed their faces against the windows and took photos. It was very human, Sela noted, that the most significant moment in Earth's diplomatic history was witnessed first by children eating sandwiches. Sela led the delegation personally. She had insisted on it. If she was going to ask these creatures to walk into a war that might kill them, she would do it face to face. She owed them that. Diallo met them in the Great Hall of the Accord, a room that humans had built specifically for moments of historical weight. High ceilings of pale stone. Long windows that framed the Alps. On the walls, murals depicting humanity's history, ancient campfires, sailing ships, the first moon landing, the first warp jump. A species writing its own mythology in oil paint and marble. Sela presented the situation without softening it. She showed them the battle data from the Helion border. She played the last transmissions from Kelmara 4, the screaming, the silence. She displayed the simulation results, every conventional strategy, every probable outcome. All of them ending in extinction. Diallo listened to all of it without interrupting. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that had seen a great deal. When Sela finished, Diallo was quiet for a long moment. "How long do we have before the Vorith reach inhabited council space?" she asked. "At current advance rate 18 months. Possibly 14 if they accelerate after taking the Centaurus line. How many people are we talking about? Total lives at risk?" Sela calculated. Across all 12 species, across all inhabited worlds in their projected path, approximately 400 billion. Diallo nodded slowly. She turned to look out the window at the Alps, at the white peaks cutting into the blue morning sky. Then she turned back. "What do you need from us?" Sela had prepared a careful diplomatic answer. A measured request. An acknowledgement of the risks, a proposed framework for limited engagement. She had rehearsed it on the shuttle. She did not deliver it. "Everything," she said instead. "We need everything you have." Silence in the Great Hall. One of Sela's aides made a small sound of alarm. Diallo looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something Sela had not expected. She smiled. Not a happy smile, a tired one. The smile of someone who had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and had just been given permission to set it down. "I'll need to speak with the Security Council, the Joint Chiefs, and about 40 other people," Diallo said. "Give me 72 hours. Sela blinked. You do not need to consult your population? A vote? A referendum? 400 billion people are going to die," Diallo said simply. "We'll hold the referendum after." The 72 hours were the most extraordinary Sela had ever witnessed. She had expected human bureaucracy, delay, negotiation, political maneuvering. Instead she watched a civilization mobilize. Humans, she was learning, were terrifying not only in war but in preparation for war. Shipyards that had been producing civilian transports were retooled within hours. Military academies were put on accelerated graduation tracks. Research divisions that had been working on terraforming and agriculture pivoted overnight to weapons systems, shield technology, and battlefield medicine. Sela watched a species that had known peace for 40 years remember, with unsettling ease, how to become something else entirely. On the third day, Diallo returned to the Accord Hall with a data tablet and set it on the table in front of Sela. "Here is what we can commit within the first 6 months," she said. 1,200 warships, 40 million trained soldiers, 8,000 fighter pilots, 200 research teams already working on Vorith bioship vulnerabilities, and something our xenobiologists are calling a cascade disruptor. Early tests suggest it can interrupt the Vorith distributed consciousness network. We think we can sever their ability to adapt in real time. Sela stared at the tablet. You developed a weapon against Vorith distributed cognition in 72 hours? We've been watching them for a while, Diallo said. We were hoping it wouldn't come to this. But we made contingency plans. You made contingency plans for a war you had not yet been asked to fight. We made contingency plans for a war we thought someone would eventually ask us to fight. Diallo corrected gently. It's something we do. Sela looked down at the tablet again. 400 billion lives. 14 months. And humans who had been planning for this in the quiet of their own minds for years, because that was simply how they were built, always preparing for the worst while hoping for the best, always ready to fight for people they had never met, always saying yes. I must be transparent with you, Sela said carefully. There are members of the council who are afraid of human involvement. Not of your capabilities. Of your nature. They believe that once humanity enters this war, the outcome, whatever it is, will reshape the galaxy in ways we cannot predict. Diallo nodded. They're probably right, she said. But the alternative is 400 billion people dying. We'll manage the reshaping together afterward. Sela nodded. She picked up the tablet. The humans were coming to war. And somewhere, the Vorith fleet continued its advance. Still confident, still invincible, still utterly unaware that the most dangerous species in the galaxy had just looked up from their campfires and started walking toward them. First contact with the void. The first human fleet arrived at the Centaurus line 6 months ahead of schedule. Admiral Yusuf Karim stood on the bridge of the UES Relentless, a vessel the size of a small moon, and looked at the tactical display with the quiet calm of a man who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Beside him, Krell Commander Yoth stared at the human ship roster in silence. He had commanded fleets before. He understood numbers. But the numbers he was looking at did not make sense within his understanding of what a species 8 decades into spacefaring was capable of producing. Admiral, he said carefully, you have 1,200 warships. But this manifest lists secondary armaments I have never encountered in any species catalog. What is a Hammer-class siege array? It's a kinetic delivery system, Karim said. We fire nickel iron slugs accelerated to a meaningful fraction of the speed of light at bioship hull material. We found that Vorith organic armor, for all its regenerative capability, has a structural weakness against hypersonic physical impact. It can't grow back fast enough. Yoth stared at him. You developed a weapon that bypasses biological regeneration by simply hitting it very fast and very hard. Essentially. How did you? Railgun technology. We've had it for 200 years. We just scaled it up. There was a long silence. The tactical display updated, Vorith fleet signatures, 37 bioships crossing the outer marker of the Centaurus line. They've seen us, said the Krell sensor officer. Their formation is adapting. They will reach optimal attack range in 12 minutes. This was the moment Yoth had been dreading. Every council engagement with the Vorith followed the same pattern. The Vorith assessed the opposing force, adapted to its capabilities in real time through their distributed network, and then attacked in perfect coordination against whatever weakness they had identified. 12 minutes was all they needed to become perfectly optimized killers. The Cascade Disruptor was not yet fully tested. They had one chance. Admiral, the disruptor prototype is on the Galileo, said a human officer. Dr. Chin says she needs 4 minutes to align it with the Vorith consciousness frequency. She has 3. Tell her. Yes, sir. Karim turned to Yoth. I'm going to ask you to trust me for about 6 minutes, Commander. During that time I need your fleet to hold position and not engage. I know that's against every tactical instinct your species has. I'm asking anyway. Yoth's mandibles clicked. You want my fleet to sit still while 37 Vorith bioships adapt to destroy us? Yes. Why? Because if the disruptor works, they won't be able to adapt. And if I charge in now before Dr. Chin is ready, they'll learn our capabilities before we can take away their ability to use that information. Yoth was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, my fleet holds position. The next 6 minutes were the longest of Yoth's life. He watched the Vorith bioships approach. He watched their formations shift and ripple as the distributed consciousness calculated, processed, and refined its attack strategy. He watched the human fleet sit absolutely still, engines idling, shields at minimum, appearing to any observer to be completely unprepared. He later learned that this stillness was deliberate. Admiral Karim had ordered every ship to present the appearance of confusion, shield fluctuations, minor power diversions, the electromagnetic signature of a fleet that had just realized it was in trouble. He had told the Vorith a story. He had given them false data to adapt to. He had lied to an alien hive mind. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, Dr. Mei Chen's voice came over the fleet channel. Cascade disruptor is live. Firing now. The Vorith fleet stopped. Not stopped moving, stopped thinking. 37 bioships, each containing a node of the distributed consciousness, went suddenly and completely silent. They drifted. Their formation dissolved into random vectors. The perfect, adaptive, coordinated intelligence that had destroyed 17 star systems became, in an instant, 37 individual biological machines with no one at the controls. The silence on the Krell flagship lasted for perhaps 2 seconds. Then Admiral Karim's voice came through, all human vessels, weapons free. Hit them before the network recovers. You have an 8-minute window. What happened in those 8 minutes was studied by military historians for the next 3 centuries. The human fleet moved with a controlled ferocity that left Yatha's experienced commanders in stunned silence. No wasted shots. No hesitation. Every Hammer-class array fired in sequenced waves that stripped regenerating armor before it could fully reform. Human fighter wings operated in patterns that their Krell counterparts had never seen, not the efficient geometry of computer-calculated combat, but something improvisational, adaptive, almost musical in its unpredictability. They were imitating the Vorith, using chaos against an enemy that thrived on chaos. When the window closed and the Vorith consciousness began to reconnect, 29 of the 37 bioships were destroyed. The remaining 8 fled toward the Helion border. They had never fled before. In recorded history, no Vorith force had ever retreated. Yath stood on his bridge and watched them go. He was trembling, an involuntary response he would later deny in his official report. He turned to find the human liaison officer assigned to his ship, a young woman named Lieutenant Priya Sharma, watching the retreating Vorith on the display with an expression he couldn't read. "Lieutenant," he said, "how are you feeling?" She thought about it. "Honestly? I feel like we just scared something that hasn't been scared in a very long time," she said. "And I'm not sure if that's a victory or a warning." Yath nodded slowly. He had been thinking something very similar. The Council trembles. The news of the Centaurus engagement reached Vega Prime Station 14 hours after the battle. Ambassador Sela received the report in her private quarters, sitting alone with a cup of something warm and reading the battle logs line by line. She read them 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long while and thought about what the Elder Vox had said. Chaos given form. A species that acted on principle rather than strategy. She had thought, when Vox said those words, that they were a warning about human unpredictability. Now she was beginning to understand that Vox had been describing a capability. The Emergency Council session convened the next morning. There was no hiding the data. Every delegate had seen the battle footage. The room was full of a complicated energy that Sela could not quite categorize. Relief, certainly, 29 Vorith bioships was more than the combined fleet had destroyed in the previous 3 years of conflict combined. But underneath the relief, something more difficult. Unease. The quiet recognition that the force they had invited into this war was not what they had assumed it to be. "This is extraordinary," said High Consul Dravan slowly. "Their disruption technology alone changes the strategic landscape entirely. And their combat doctrine." "Their combat doctrine is barely a doctrine at all," interrupted Elder Vox. The ancient Selendi's voice was measured, but Sela detected something beneath it. They improvised. In a fleet engagement. Against an enemy with 30 cycles of experience fighting every known species. They improvised and it worked. "Is that not a good thing?" asked Tessali. "It is an extraordinary thing," Vox said. "And extraordinary things require extraordinary caution. We understand conventional warfare. We can model it. We can predict how fleets will move, how commanders will decide, what the outcomes of battles will likely be. We cannot model the humans. We cannot predict them. And if we cannot predict them, then neither can the Vorith," Sela said. Vox turned to look at her. "Correct. But also, we cannot predict what they will do with the influence they are accruing. We invited them into this war as junior partners. After Centaurus, every species in this council will look to them as something else entirely. No one disputed that." Meanwhile, at the Helion border, the 8 surviving Vorith bioships had returned to the main fleet, a dark and terrible thing of 800 vessels that waited in the deep void like a thundercloud gathering itself to strike. What happened within the Vorith distributed consciousness in the hours following Centaurus was not known to any council species. But its effects were unmistakable. The fleet did not advance for 6 days. 6 days. The Vorith, who had never hesitated in 400 years of conquest, paused. In 6 days they assessed what had happened to them. They felt, for perhaps the first time, something analogous to what organic beings called fear. On the seventh day they adapted. The distributed consciousness restructured itself around the cascade disruptor's frequency, building neural firewalls that would resist future disruption. They were still the most dangerous military force in the known galaxy. But they were no longer invincible. And they knew it. More importantly, they now knew that the humans knew it. Back at Vega Prime, a message arrived from the Vorith for the first time in recorded history. A single transmission, broadcast on all Council frequencies. It was addressed not to the Galactic Council, not to any of the 12 species, but to humanity specifically. It read in rough translation, "You are new. You are small. You do not understand what you have entered. Withdraw from this conflict and we will not touch your worlds for 100 cycles. This is not a threat. It is an offer. We do not offer. Remember that." The council chamber went very quiet when the translation was displayed. "They are afraid of us," Tessali said softly. She sounded almost awed. "They are afraid of the unknown," Vox corrected. "Which is what we have been telling you. The humans are unpredictable even to a consciousness that has modeled every known species. This is a tactical advantage. It is also why they are being warned off. The Vorith are not stupid. They know that an unpredictable enemy is more dangerous than a powerful one." "What will the humans say?" Dravan asked. Sela was already reading the human response, which had arrived 30 minutes after the Vorith transmission. Secretary General Diallo had replied on behalf of Earth with a message so short it fit in 2 lines. She read it aloud, "Thank you for the offer. Our answer is no. We'll see you at the next engagement." The chamber erupted. Half the delegates were alarmed. The other half were trying, not entirely successfully, to conceal the fact that they found this profoundly satisfying. Sela set down the message and looked around the room at the council she had served for 30 years. She thought about the vote that had sent her to Earth. 7-5. 5 delegates who had been afraid enough to vote no. She wondered how they were feeling now. And then, beneath the diplomatic composure she had spent a lifetime cultivating, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel in a session like this. She felt proud. The day the Vorith learned. They called it the Battle of Kara's Void, though battle suggested a kind of order that the engagement never really had. It was better described as a storm, or as Lieutenant Priya Sharma later wrote in her memoir, "The day we stopped playing defense." The plan had been Admiral Karim's, refined over months of intelligence gathering, alien engineering consultation, and what he privately called an alarming number of late-night conversations with people smarter than me. It was not a plan that any other species in the Council would have conceived, because it required accepting a level of calculated risk that every military doctrine in the galactic community defined as catastrophic. The plan was to go to the Vorith. Not to meet them at the border. Not to defend the core worlds. Not to wait for them to come and then react. To cross into Vorith space with a strike force of human and allied vessels, hit the bioship construction yards at Karas, and destroy the Vorith's capacity to produce new fleet vessels faster than they could lose them. Elder Vox had objected to this plan for 3 hours before finally going silent and saying, with the weariness of someone who has just realized arguing is pointless, "You are going to do this regardless of what I say, aren't you?" "With respect, Elder," Admiral Karim had replied, "we're not asking for permission. We're asking for support." In the end, the Council committed a combined force of 400 vessels to support the human strike fleet of 300. 700 ships against the most heavily defended space in the known galaxy. Krell Commander Yoth volunteered his personal flagship for the mission. He later said it was the most frightened he had ever been, and also the most alive. They dropped out of warp at the edge of the Kara's Void at 0400 hours ship time. What greeted them was the full weight of Vorith defensive response. 600 bioships, the largest single concentration of Vorith force ever recorded, forming a wall between the strike fleet and the construction yards. For 11 seconds neither side moved. Then Admiral Karim's voice came through the fleet channel. He did not give a tactical order. He did not quote strategic doctrine or reference engagement protocols. He said very simply, "We are here because 400 billion people are counting on us. Everyone knows what to do. Let's go." What followed was 6 hours of the most ferocious space combat in recorded history. The cascade disruptors fired in rotating waves. The Vorith firewalls held for the first hour, then began to crack as Dr. Chen's team deployed a second-generation disruptor variant they had built in the past 8 months. Human fighter wings flew patterns that no combat AI had ever generated, dangerous, beautiful, mathematically improbable arcs that somehow resolved into tactical perfection. Hammer arrays fired in concert with Krell energy weapons and Aerith shield cutter technology, a fusion of a dozen species' best ideas that no one had ever tried to combine before. But it was not the technology that decided the battle. It was a decision made by a 23-year-old human pilot named Corporal Daisuke Nomura, flying a damaged fighter with one engine and no missiles, who instead of retreating located the command node bioship at the center of the Vorith fleet and flew his vessel directly at its core at maximum acceleration. He ejected 1 second before impact. The command node ship exploded. The distributed consciousness, momentarily centerless, fragmented across 600 vessels simultaneously. In the 7-second window of disorientation that followed, the human fleet executed a coordinated push that broke the Vorith formation for the first time in the war. Nomura was recovered from his escape pod 40 minutes later, uninjured except for a burn on his left hand from a malfunctioning ejection handle. He later said, when asked why he had done it, that he had simply run out of other options and the math seemed to work out. The Vorith construction yards at Karas burned for 3 days. When it was over, when the surviving Vorith vessels had retreated, when the fleet had taken stock of its losses and its victories, Krell Commander Yoth found himself standing in the observation bay of the human flagship Relentless, looking out at the distant glow of the burning yards, beside the young Lieutenant Sharma, who had been assigned as his liaison since Centaurus and had become, in the way of soldiers who survive impossible things together, something like a friend. "It's not over," he said. He was not speaking of the battle. "No," she agreed. "But it's turning. Your species," he said after a long pause. "We were afraid of you. The Council. When Ambassador Sela proposed asking for your help, 5 species voted against it. I was one of them." She looked at him. "I know. We thought you were too unpredictable. Too dangerous. Too a human. And now." Yoth thought about what he had watched over the past year. The ships arriving early. Diallo's 72 hours. The hammer arrays. The Cascade disruptor. Nomura's last missile run. The way human officers laughed before the hard fights, the way they went quiet after. The way they grieved for enemies who had been trying to kill them and celebrated victories by asking about the wounded on the other side. The way they had walked into the most dangerous war in galactic history and immediately started trying to end it. "Now," he said, "I think the Council was right to be afraid. But not for the reasons we thought." He turned to look at her. "We were afraid you would make the galaxy more dangerous. But you are making it more complicated. And that, I am beginning to understand, is something very different." Sharma nodded. She looked back at the burning yards. 400 billion people who would live because of the last year. The Vorith, retreating, not conquered, not destroyed, but for the first time in their history negotiating. The Council of 12 species, already arguing about how to handle the post-war order, already afraid of what humanity would want in the peace, already sure the answer would surprise them. She thought about Diallo's words in the Accord Hall, nearly 2 years ago. "We'll manage the reshaping together afterward." The reshaping was coming. It was already here. A galaxy that had been old and afraid and calcified in its certainties was confronting the youngest species in its community, a species that had shown up 80 years ago with warp drives and bad poetry and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was inevitable, and discovering that the future it had feared was not destruction. It was change. The stars burned on outside the viewport, ancient and indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere out there, Vorith vessels were retreating toward a home system that had never been threatened. Somewhere out there, 12 species were already learning to argue with humans about what came next. Somewhere out there, 400 billion people were alive who might not have been. Lieutenant Priya Sharma, age 29, veteran of Centaurus and Kara's Void, turned away from the window and went to find something to eat. The war was not over. But for the first time it had a direction. And the direction was forward.